Now we challenge all of you listening to this Chronicles. If there is anyone at all at this stage that can present one witness, one single evidence in any Philippine court today that will prove that money was taken from the Filipino people, please come out and say so. Because for the past 35 years, over 1,000 cases were filed now against Imelda Marcos, but not one single document could prove that the money in the accounts that they are accusing her as having contained money did not come from the Filipino people. They were dismissed for lack of merit and dismissed for lack of evidence. 1,000 cases filed by the Philippine government against her. Perhaps at some later date, I will discuss this 1,000 cases filed against Imelda Marcos. But for now, these are the records in New York. Foley Square, the court of Judge Kinnan, and the unanimous decision, not guilty, Ferdinand and Imelda. Not a single document, not a single witness to prove that any money, 1 centavo, $1, 1 peso, 10 pesos, were ever stolen from the Filipino people. Over the years, we've come across the question, what did Marcos steal from the Filipino people? This question comes up every time there are discussions, every time there are newspaper accounts, when they talk about this on radio and on television. And for the past 35 years or so, that has always been the question raised, that Marcos stole billions and billions of pesos from the Filipino people. And so it's important somehow that for someone like me, who has covered the office of the President, my curiosity is likewise like the most of us. What was stolen from the Filipino people? But then again, it is difficult to get into the personal accounts or the personal matters of the person that you're covering, for instance, like in television or in radio. So how do we really know whether Marcos did steal the money of the Filipino people? When I was covering Malacanang, the office of the President and that of the First Lady, of course the coverage only involved the public events, public affairs as they are considered as those affecting the rest of the nation, policy statements, inaugurations, anniversaries, and every once in a while they have this affair in the palace or in Malacanang, as you would call it, and that is just about all that you would actually know about this. But then after 1986, there came all of these issues that Marcos stole the money of the Filipino people. But what happened was they did not file any case against Ferdinand Marcos here in the Philippines. As a matter of fact, what happened was they were brought in exile in Honolulu, we all know this, and it was there in the United States of America that actually had, in conjunction with the Philippine government, the filing of criminal cases against them. They were in Honolulu at the time. And so what happened was the first case that they filed actually was in the Los Angeles court. This was the trial court under Mariana Feltzer. She was the judge at the time. And they filed again, as we've said, several of these cases saying that the money that Marcos stole from the Filipino people was brought to the United States of America, and that is why the courts of America will have jurisdiction over the persons of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. So that was it. But where do I come in as far as that was concerned? Well, at one time, we came to visit after a year actually that I was on hold order here in the Philippines. We came to visit President Marcos and Mrs. Marcos in Honolulu, and that was when we first learned that there were actually a number of cases that were filed against them. After that, we also learned that there were other cases filed elsewhere in the United States, also for human rights violations. But right now, let's discuss, or let me talk about this so that you would know what I know about this firsthand, as you would say, up close and personal. So, the first case that they filed in LA, in Los Angeles court, was the RICO case. This is the Racketeering and Influence Corrupt Practices Organizations Act, RICO. That's the acronym for that particular law of the United States of America. This refers to criminal syndicates like the mafiosi, the mafia, or whatever other underground sleazy work is being done by those illegal activities. And that was exactly how they pictured Ferdinand Marcos, that he ran the Philippine government as a criminal enterprise. And the money of the Filipino people, he stole this and then brought it to the United States of America. And there he purchased several properties, and that is why America had jurisdiction over them. Now let's get to the bottom of this. Remember that all the documents as far as the Philippine budget is concerned are all filed in the Department of Justice of our country. All of this include what we call as the General Appropriations Act. That is where you see all the money that we are collecting or the government is collecting as far as taxes are concerned, all the money that comes in as far as investments are concerned, and that is all part of the budget. And that is supposed to be programmed every year as to where it is going to go. First, they go to the salaries and the maintenance of the government itself, and then next you have all the programs and the projects that the government wishes to implement. Those are the documents, and it is there in the Department of Budget. And then, of course, you also have documents that they found in Malacanang. When the Marcoses left, as you have already seen this on television, they left quite hurriedly. And so all the documents were just either scattered all over the place, or they were in the vaults, or they were in the filing cabinets. And so all of those documents were sorted out, and they were brought in a certain residence, and together with the incoming officials of the Philippine government, Salonga and Mrs. Aquino and Fidel Ramos and Juan Ponce Enrile, several others, looked over these documents and they gathered them together. And that was part also of the documents that they presented to the United States of America. There was some kind of a legal understanding between, at the time, it was Salonga and a lady named Tensing, that's her family name, and they had this mutual legal agreement that whatever documents either America or the Philippine government has will be part of the evidences that they will present in court against the Marcoses. In addition to that, whatever other documents the Marcos may have carried with them when they went to Honolulu after the American government flew them, got them from the Clark Air Force Base and then to Guam and then to Honolulu. When they landed at the Honolulu airport, all the other documents that they may have carried with them, the United States government also confiscated them. So, and then the Swiss government likewise had documents of the bank accounts written under the names of foundations. As I already mentioned even before, they were not under the name of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, they were under the name of foundations. So you could see that three governments, the Philippine government, the United States government, and the Swiss government gathered together all possible documents that they could use in order to file the criminal case against Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. Now, a curiosity way of looking at things is where a journalist usually would go. Sometimes you call them investigative journalists, or sometimes you would call them just inquisitive journalists. My interest there is precisely that. Not only because I was already working in Malacanang at the time, when all of these things were supposed to have been unearthed, but also because I would also like to find out by myself, for myself, that the persons I was covering, as far as television is concerned, and that is Ferdinand and Imelda, were actually in some way involved in all the accusations that were coming out in the media that they stole the money of the Filipino people. And so it happened that at the time, there was nobody, practically nobody, who wanted to be associated with them, especially those who made money on them, those who were able to gain favors from them. And so you could see that nobody would want to go there to defend them or to help them out. And so I don't know what happened. It is not coincidence, but by a strange twist of fate, Mrs. Marcos called up and said that they were having all of these problems with the cases, etc., and all of this, and if I could come to help. Well, the reason for this was because there was nobody else actually that would come to, at least to be by their side, perhaps, or something, some kind of a moral support. So that began actually the journals that I wrote as far as interviewing both Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, or the inner side of their stories, not the ones I was covering for the public, but perhaps to find out exactly what their answers would be regarding all those accusations. And that was when President Marcos said that you may accuse me of anything, but I did not steal the money of the Filipino people. But again, that will have to be proven. So what happened there was, excuse me, when the trial was going on in the court of this Mariana Felzer of the Los Angeles court, the court had to dismiss the case because there were no evidences that were given in as far as the court was concerned that showed that Marcos got the money from the Filipino people, or the money from the budget of the Philippines, or the money from the treasury of the Philippines. So the court dismissed the case. But there was an appeal. The appeal was undertaken by the former ambassador of America to the Philippines. You will remember his name, Michael Armacos. And so he petitioned the court that you cannot do this, dismissing this case, because we will be able to find out also some kind of an evidence about the guilt of Marcos and Imelda. So the court instead, what happened was, with that appeal, it was elevated to the Ninth Circuit Court of Los Angeles. What happened there? Well, the justices also reviewed the case. There was only one witness, and that was a certain Mr. Fernando. And that was in the Court of Appeals, the cases were also dismissed. Why? Because according to the records of the court, and this was a statement made by the justices, this Mr. Fernando only testified to the newspaper accounts that were brought to court. In other words, whatever came out in the newspapers, that's exactly the kind of evidence they presented. There was nothing new. There was no exact evidence, clear evidence, because remember, this is a criminal case. And even in the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, you need to have evidence that is beyond reasonable doubt. So that's exactly what happened. It was dismissed. So you could see that the court in the Ninth Circuit Court of LA also dismissed that, and it is very interesting for those of you studying law and perhaps even the lawyers, if you would just go over the statements made or the decision made by the justices in that court. They said something like this: if Marcos at gunpoint went to the Central Bank of the Philippines or to the National Treasury and got the money of the people there, and then kept that money under his mattress, and then sometime got the money out and bought real estate properties here in the United States of America, then there is actually that fraud, or there you could see that Marcos stole the money of the Filipino people. But unless sometime, at any time you are not able to come up with such an evidence, then indeed that case will have to be dismissed. Plus, of course, there was what is known as the act of state doctrine, which means that the act of a sovereign state cannot be questioned by another sovereign state, because then this criminal case should have been tried here in the Philippines. And that's exactly what I have been trying to say all these years. Why did they not allow President Marcos to return to the Philippines so that he would be able to defend himself here in our courts under the administration of Mrs. Aquino, where all of us will actually be listening to his defense? And so all of you now that are questioning what money did he steal, or those of you that are still accusing him he stole the money, why did you not give him that chance to come home? That is the most fundamental human right of any citizen of our republic, to be able to confront all of those that are alleging these accusations against him. But it was never done. Why did they not ask him to come home and stand the trial itself? Well, it was not done. So you could see that up to this day, with all the questions being raised, this is the man who could have been able to explain to all of us, where did you get all that money, all the accounts that were found in those documents that they saw in Malacanang, all the documents that they saw that they got from Switzerland, and whatever else they suspect, whatever else they would surmise, whatever else they would conclude, all of this, he would have been able to explain it and defend himself, and then there would have been a period already. Did he steal the money of the Filipino people? But it never happened, and it was never done. So that was the case that actually never ever found any reason or any conclusion except with the decisions and the statements made by the justices of the Ninth Circuit Court of LA. You could go over these documents. They are public documents. It is very easy to source them, as a matter of fact, and it would be very interesting for you to read this, especially lawyers today here in the Philippines would want to find out, and perhaps even those in media who keep on repeating, the dictator stole this, the money, he stole that much, he stole several billions. If you would go over the decision of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals already, then you would see that once and for all, that was the decision that they have come up with. But that is not all. Well, the case continues, of course, not just in LA, but then you had another case that was filed in the city of New York, because there were 4 real estate properties that Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Marcos were accused of having bought, and so therefore they transferred money from the Philippine government to buy those buildings. I'll talk about that in a second installment of this, but for now it is important for us to realize that one of the most basic things as far as the rights of any human being is concerned is to return to his country of origin. That is not just a universal law, that is also Philippine law. But they denied this of President Marcos. He did file a case with the Supreme Court appealing that he come home to the Philippines several times, several attempts, until it reached the Supreme Court. In fact, when his mother died, he wanted to return home. When his sister died, he wanted to return home. When there was going to be supposedly a trial against him here, he also wanted to get home. But that was denied him. I'll talk about the other case, which is a continuation of that denial. And so when we say, what happened to the money? And did he steal the money of the people? Well, as far as the Los Angeles Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal is concerned, the case was dismissed. He did not have there was no evidence that he got any money from the Filipino people. But the saga of this particular question has not stopped there. In the New York City, they filed another case. This was done when Marcos was already dead. This was actually, well, he was dead. I mean, he was already bedridden in a way that he was in and out of the hospital, but the case was already filed, but he was not indicted as yet. But he could not appear in the New York indictment session because the doctors in Honolulu would not allow him to travel. That would be dangerous to his health. He could die while traveling. So it was Imelda Marcos that went to New York City. That was sometime in October, close to winter time, as a matter of fact. How do they call it? When it is gray November or gray October in your soul, it is also gray November in the weather. But she traveled to New York precisely to be at the court in Foley Square. That is the court of Judge Keenan. And that was where she had to make the plea of not guilty. Again, the law that she violated was the RICO case, and this time the accusation was because there were 4 buildings that were allegedly bought by the Marcoses. These 4 buildings were the prime real estate properties in New York City. You had the Crown Building, 40 Wall Street, the number 5 Madison, and then of course the Herald Center, which I think would be very popular to those who would be shopping at Macy's. All of these 4 real estate properties were allegedly bought by President Marcos, and allegedly the money that was used to buy these real estate properties came from the Filipino people. That was when, at the time, President Marcos was already dead. He died, and that was, I think, Well, he was dead for about 6, 7 months already. So it was just the widow of President Marcos, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, who had to appear in that courthouse for close to 4 months of trial for this alleged violation of that RICO law of the United States of America. Again, all the documents that came from the Swiss banks, Swiss government, the documents that were obtained from Malacanang, from the vaults and the filing cabinets of the Marcoses, and all the documents that were obtained from the arrival of the Marcoses in Honolulu, they were all used as part of the evidences for that particular case. How many are these? That's 350,000 pages of documents. And they lined up 95 witnesses. So the trial lasted from, the jury selection sometime in March, all the way until July. So you can imagine how the daily trial actually brought about all of these evidences presented to court. There was a 12-man jury that was already earlier selected, but there was an additional 6 other members just in case any member of the regular jury would get sick or would have to beg leave and all of this. They did not want the trial to be hampered or be canceled or be delayed precisely because there was a jury that was not present. So we had 12 members of the regular jury plus 6 others. So there were about 18 of them, that were actually there, witnessing the day-to-day sessions of the trial itself. So as I was saying, this is the second part of the first part that I mentioned earlier. Both the RICO case was actually the one involved. But in New York, what happened there was Mrs. Marcos again requested if I could be there with her. I have to repeat the fact that nobody wanted to be with her at the time. This was when all the cabinet members of President Marcos were trying to avoid any association with him. Lawyers, perhaps, who also were friends of the Marcoses also didn't want to be associated with them because anybody that the FBI or the CIA or the intelligence agencies or the Justice Department of America, anybody who would go to Honolulu would be photographed, fingerprinted at the airport. They would do this and then to try and find out what is the connection with the Marcoses. They might be involved in the cases, likewise, that the United States of America has filed against the Marcoses. So that is why a lot of people feared going there and they refrained from being associated. And so there was nobody else, perhaps, or there were several others that were there, but Mrs. Marcos requested if I could join her during the trial. Firstly, because early on, in the office of one of the lawyers here in the Philippines, we were already given copies of the, not only of the indictment against the Marcoses, but also a number of those evidences so that we could find out if there were any other evidences here in the Philippines, either in government offices, that could be utilized in defense of the Marcoses. So since they knew, Imelda knew that I was going over these documents, perhaps I could help out. And that was the reason why I did help out by joining the staff of Jerry Spence, who was later on hired as the defender or the counsel of Mrs. Marcos, together with his staff. One of them was a public accountant, in fact, because this involved a lot of accounts and a lot of computations that were necessary, and also to find out the money going in and the money going out and so forth, all of these little details. Anyway, so we had 4 months of the trial, and that's exactly why I could speak this way, because I went over 350,000 pages of documents, which occupied not practically, but really one whole room in the Dag Hammarskjöld Towers. And you can imagine that the prosecution would go into the courtroom, not carrying an attaché, but pushing a grocery cart, a big grocery cart, the one that you use when you buy other items in the supermarket. Well, all the documents for a day were inside a grocery cart because it was a voluminous documents. Okay, 350,000 documents. And they lined up 95 witnesses. So in one day, we would have, for instance, the testimonies of bank managers, testimonies of bank accountants, testimonies of other people from the Philippines who were involved possibly with knowing whether Marcos had any deposits here, any deposits there, and so forth. But as I've said, there will still have to be anyone among all of these 95 witnesses who would be able to say clearly and categorically and with evidence presented that the money that was used to purchase those real estate properties in New York City came from the money of the Filipino people. I repeated this already in the last episode that we had here in these chronicles, that the money of the Filipino people you will find in the treasury or perhaps in the central bank or perhaps in the national budget. That is the money collected from us, the people, in the form of taxes. So, what was needed insofar as all of this is concerned was that direct evidence. 95 witnesses, 350,000 pages of documents, and there was not one single document nor one single witness who could categorically say, here, this is the document that will prove that the money came from the Philippine Treasury or the Filipino people. So what happened? Well, you had all of these documents and evidences and testimonies all saying, really proving that the money was there from Switzerland, from the bank accounts in Switzerland, and from there it went to some banks in Los Angeles, and from Los Angeles banks some money was transferred to New York banks, to the Philippine National Bank as a matter of fact, and from there the purchase of the buildings were actually undertaken. But the biggest question and the most important question was, and this is what Jerry Spence asked all of these people that were testifying there, where did the money in Switzerland come from? And that nobody could answer. Nobody knew where the accounts of Switzerland came from. Where did all those millions of dollars come from? Because that is the evidence that would have proven that it came from the Philippines, from the Filipino people. But there was nobody, and there was not one single document that could prove that. And that is why at the end of the trial, after 4 months, after all these documents being presented, and all the witnesses talking and talking and talking, not one could present that single document. And so therefore, by a unanimous decision of the 12-member jury, the case was not dismissed, but there was the decision not guilty. In other words, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos were not guilty as far as the accusation of the United States of America, the RICO case violation, is concerned. So, now we challenge all of you listening to this Chronicles. If there is anyone at all at this stage that can present one witness, one single evidence in any Philippine court today that will prove that money was taken from the Filipino people, please come out and say so. Because for the past 35 years, over 1,000 cases were filed now against Imelda Marcos. But not one single document could prove that the money in the accounts that they are accusing her as having contained money did not come from the Filipino people. They were dismissed for lack of merit and dismissed for lack of evidence. 1,000 cases filed by the Philippine government against her. Perhaps at some later date, I will discuss this 1,000 cases filed against Imelda Marcos. But for now, these are the records in New York. Foley Square, the court of Judge Kinnan, and the unanimous decision, not guilty, Ferdinand and Imelda. Not a single document, not a single witness to prove that any money, 1 centavo, $1, 1 peso, 10 pesos, were ever stolen from the Filipino people.